So shifting gears a little bit towards, we want to talk to you about the book you wrote about the red heifer. And so one of these things in prophecy that's coming up is, the temple is talked about. And there hasn't been a temple for close to 2,000 years now. But Jesus talks about a temple. Second Thessalonians mentions a temple. And those things are talking about a physical temple. And so, right now, there's a pretty good understanding from most Christians that, well, something would have to happen to the Dome on the Rock to be able to build a temple. But I think I've heard you mention before that that's not necessarily the case, that there's other room to build a temple. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about that a little bit? Like where else could the temple end up being?
Yeah, there's there, as people know, even amongst the rabbis today, no different than in Jesus' days. You have factions: the Pharisees, the Sadducees. You had the Herodians, you had the Zealots, you had other groups certainly at the time, and even the Essenes. Out in the desert. So it's no different today. The human nature is what it is. So within the rabbinic movement today, there are a lot of factions, and each of them are looking for their own level of supremacy, that they want to be the go-to people. That's just the way it is. I mean, everybody does it that way. But what's interesting is, so within that, you have archaeologists who do not have access to work on top of the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is huge. It's 37 acres. I mean, if you go up there, I've been up there many times, people are surprised at how big it is. And so what you've had beginning really in the 90s, you have people doing as much archaeology as they can. A lot of times it's based on some of the archaeology that was done in the late 1800s, Charles Warren, Robinson, and others who were able at the time before you had less suspicion by the Muslims at the time, and they allowed these European white guys to come and dig underneath in different places. So there's a lot of very interesting maps that they created back then about a lot of the tunnels that are happening underneath the Temple Mount. So a lot of what's happening in the modern understanding of the archaeology of Jerusalem, specifically the Temple Mount, they've come up with primarily three different scenarios based on archaeology. One is that it's the original temple stood on the Dome of the Rock. I mean, right there, again, in the center of the Temple Mount. Others have said it was more to the south, prior to where before the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built. And then, the Dome of the Rock was built in the 7th century, late 7th century. And so the other place is that it's in the north, just north of the Dome of the Rock. And so you have these three locations. And sometimes when people discuss the future temple, as you said, there is a Greek word, naos. It has the idea of a physical temple. Jesus was walking around in the temple. It can also refer to the body. 1 Corinthians 6:19, your physical body is the temple. And it can also refer to the church in 1 Corinthians 3:16, that the church is the temple. But we know, so you have three options when you look at these passages. Does it mean physical temple, the body, or the church? And so some people go, don't you know that the temple is a church? We don't need a temple. Well, we know that. We know in John 4, Jesus said to the woman at the well, hey, there's coming a time that you're going to worship the Father and it's not going to matter. It's the physical location is going to be irrelevant. But the Jews obviously don't recognize that. And so when Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 and Paul as well in Revelation 11 and even Daniel 9:27, there is going to be a temple. It's a physical temple. It's not the church. It's not the physical body. There is a temple that's going to be there. And so when you look at this, there, again, you have the options. I don't think the southern portion would be considered, but the question is God going to allow an earthquake that destroys the Dome of the Rock, or is it going to be built just to the north? I've seen architectural plans for the building of the third temple. Some of them include where it is on the Dome of the Rock, but others, actually, I've seen it where there's a wall. There's like a 20-foot wall that's built just to the north of the Dome of the Rock, that the wall goes east-west. And then right on the other side of that, in a location known as the Dome of the Spirits, there's a little, a little monument that's sitting there where you can look at it, where that would be where it would be centered. And so in those plans, you have the temple being there. We don't really know, but what we do know is that it's going to happen. So how it all comes to play, not sure, but you do have, I would say this kind of an enclosure on this segment, or at least in my thoughts, is after 1967, when Israel became controlling of they conquered basically East Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount Faithful was a group that started immediately. They're like, this is our chance, Gershon Solomon. And then, of course, in the late 1980s, you had the Temple Institute being formed. Well, you can go to the Temple Institute today. They have everything done. I mean, everything is done, ready to roll. All they're waiting for is the political will of the government to give them permission. Now, how that's going to work, we're not sure. But everything's done. The menorah, the altar of incense, the gold, the vestments of the priest. They have all the priests, and that's why I wrote the book on the red heifer, because the subtitle is the last piece of the third temple puzzle. They have everything else ready to go, but they need the red heifer to be slaughtered so they can get the ashes in order to purify not only the people who want to come up and offer a sacrifice, but to purify the area. So hypothetically, they could build the temple now if the geopolitical will was there. They just couldn't use it. That's why they need the red heifer. And so the fact that, 5 red heifers were brought over to Israel in September of 22 was pretty amazing. And 3 of them now 100% are qualified. They are of age. They need to be 2 years and 1 month. That happened in November of last year. They've talked about this potential having the offering and the ceremony in April 22nd of Passover, which is coming up. And again, it doesn't need to happen on the Temple Mount. It actually specifically says it has to happen on the Mount of Olives. So here we are living in all these big picture things. And again, I'm not dramatic. I'm actually can be pretty boring. I'm kind of a nerd guy, but or sensationalistic. But we can seriously say that this is the first time since the first century that all these pieces are in place, and then you have at least 3 cows, maybe 4. One of them has been disqualified, and that is absolutely unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. So exciting times. Again, in these big picture things, which I would hope that the average Christian says, oh, really? I didn't even really know about this. Things are moving. And so it's good for us to be knowledgeable. Why? To point people to the gospel. I mean, that's why we're here, to say, hey, everybody, look at what's happening. This isn't made up. I mean, there can be sensational stuff, but again, even as boring as I can be, hey, this is pretty amazing.
Mondo, I want to be. You're bringing up so many amazing things, and I'm trying to put myself in the place of somebody who's going, "Wait, what? What? Like, why are we talking about cows? I read my Bible, where I don't remember this in Revelation, So there's this there's a Western mindset to these things that's informed by everything from Left Behind to many others. Can you connect the dots for somebody who's going, why is he talking about heifers? What is this? I don't recall that in scripture specifically, because I love what you're doing, but it's bringing in stuff that is obvious if you're of certain Jewish heritage or have spent a lot of time in certain circles or a lot of time in Israel. And as we talk about the Temple Mount, some people, I've been able to be there. And so I'm kind of nodding along with you. I'm realizing some people are like, I'm sorry, what? So what? So just to get our audience kind of all calibrated, there's a pretty broad agreement that if the temple is rebuilt in Israel, that's a likely precondition to the kinds of things we see in Revelation, the Antichrist and some of these others. And that hasn't been done, and it hasn't seemed possible for a very long time. And what Mondo's describing is that there are a lot of smart and dedicated people who have been working very hard to make this possible for a lot of reasons, not necessarily because they're trying to fulfill Revelation, but because there's a lot of political spaghetti going on, and everybody has their own motivations. But we're seeing these events kind of line up and up. In the 90s, when people were freaking out about Y2K might be the end of the world and all these other things, one of the big things was, there's no temple in Israel. And there are others as well. But now some of that's changing. And one of the necessary elements in that conversation is this whole conversation around the red heifer, which has become a hot topic recently, but I don't think very many people understand. Can you give a quick primer? And I know, by the way, you wrote a book on it, and we encourage our listeners to go get a copy and read it. But can you tell people what they're going to find in there and why they should care whether or not a certain cow of a certain color is in a certain place at a certain time?
That's a great, that was really my goal, because when 5 cows get shipped over, to the land of Israel with much fanfare in September of 22.
And heavy security.
And heavy security.
What is going on here?
And expensive. These things were, they paid these Jewish rabbis paid $100,000 each for the cows. They spent $200,000 to $250,000 shipping them over on a special American Airlines airplane. And so I thought, at the time, you know what? I think the average Christian, as we see these things develop, I said, I want to write a book on this to help them to understand it, to walk them through. Why should I even care? Why should I care about red cows? Well, and the other thing too is Christians naturally, I was, again, being a pastor, I understand this. They can be very sensitive to going, hey, wait a minute. Jesus is the final sacrifice. Yes, we all agree. Okay. 100%. Jesus is the final sacrifice. Read the book of Hebrews. We know that. And so what my goal was in the book is to say, okay, we know that what Jesus said and others, that there'll be this temple. Okay. As we discussed, that is a fact. But it doesn't tell us all the details about how that's going to come to be. It just gives us a snapshot. There it is. It's existing by the middle of the 7-year tribulation period. So one of my goals was to say, okay, I want you to get into the mindset of a Jewish rabbi. Now, again, I don't agree with them. But this is their mindset. And like you mentioned, they don't know they're fulfilling prophecy or the book of Revelation. They certainly aren't going to try to fulfill any words that Jesus might have said. But their heart, their goal, again, think about it from even the first century. In John chapter 5, Jesus is having this argument with the Pharisees, and they're very clear. We have Moses. We don't need you. We have Moses. And he says, well, if you really follow Moses, John 5, you would follow me because he wrote about me. And so for them, because they rejected Jesus at the time, and still for the most part, not all Jews, but, because there are those that believe in Jesus, praise the Lord. But for the most part, the Jews still reject Jesus. And so he's not even in the picture. They don't even care about him. So for them, in their Judaism, the only place they go is Moses. So for them, Moses introduced, by God's grace, it wasn't bad, introduced the temple, the tabernacle, all the sacrificial systems, including the red heifer. The red heifer is in the book of Numbers, chapter 19. So this isn't unbiblical the way that it was. And so for the average Jewish person today, they don't realize that Jesus fulfilled all of that. So in their mind, it's a commandment. It has not been changed. So why do they want to do the red heifer? Well, because Moses said to do it. Why do they want to offer their sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem? Well, because that's what Moses said to do. So in their mind, in order to fulfill commandments of God, we need to have a temple again, and we need to perform the red heifer ceremony so that we can get the ashes, which are mixed with water to purify everything. Why? So we can offer the sacrifices according to what Moses said. So they're doing all this in their own way. We know from other further New Testament revelation by Paul and Jesus that as they do this and they make this agreement with the Antichrist, this covenant to fulfill the commandments of Moses, that their goal is, again, to try to honor God in this way. Well, we know they're incorrect. We know that that's not going to work. The blood of bulls and goats will not take away sin. Hebrews 10:4 says that. So as they do this, though, they're fulfilling prophecy that they don't know they're fulfilling. And we have the Christian revelation, again, John and Paul and others telling us, hey, guys, this is going to happen. And this is going to be the way that God is going to allow them. They are going to make their way to redo the temple in Jerusalem, and God is going to allow them to do that. He's not going to endorse this temple. He's going to allow them to do that, and they're going to be betrayed by the Antichrist. Why? Ultimately, God says, Jeremiah 30, verse 7, this is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he will be saved out of it. We know in Hosea 5:15 that Jesus said, the Messiah, I'm going to go return to heaven until they acknowledge their offense of rejecting Jesus. And in their distress, they will seek him. And so we know that by the end of the tribulation period, they're going to call out upon Jesus. Jesus said in Matthew 23, 37 to 39, hey, You will not see me again, Jews, the leadership of the Jews, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And I love the word until. That's a time marker. It's like, circle it. And so Jesus says, when you say, blessed is he who comes, I'll return. And we know that there's a whole study you can do this on, is what does it take for Jesus to return? Well, honestly, we can get Jesus to return right now, hypothetically, if we convince Netanyahu and all of the Israeli government to say, we are so sorry for what we did in our history of killing Jesus, and we repent. Jesus is the Messiah. Will you please come back? He will. If they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, he will return. Now, that's not very likely to happen, but that's the purpose of the tribulation, is God getting the attention of Israel. And by the time of the end, they will ask him to return. And Paul says in Romans 11:25, all Israel will be saved. And that really is the overarching view of all of end time prophetic history.